This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Monday, October 19th, 2020, Year of Decision. We'll finish up the Republic on Wednesday when we'll turn to Books 9 and 10. And you'll see in Book 9, we'll turn to Voldemort, for those of you who have already danced through Harry Potter. The Great Weighing of Tyranny. And as we'll see how Book 8 prepares for that examination of the most unhappy fella. We finished Book 7, and we learned that the best city is a possibility, although not a probability, in fact not a likelihood, because in the same way that the Republic begins with Socrates being compelled to come back to his house and to engage in philosophy, where in essence, by these good-natured young men, Socrates is actually forced to become the philosophical ruler of this tiny city all night. They must have been drinking Fresca rather than wine. But in the same way, we've seen that in order for the philosophers to come to rule, which is the only ground for the perfection of the city, their natural desire is to philosophize. They don't want to have to administer the public toilet system of even the perfect city, but nevertheless, they have to be compelled to rule. And as what will actually bring it into being, as we saw at the end of Book 7, you're going to persuade everyone over the age of 10 to leave and turn the city over to the philosophers, their children. So possible, but not likelihood, because since the philosophers really don't want to rule, they have to be compelled to rule. And it's a question whether even to bring, you could say, why would they want to do this what Socrates really wants to do is walk around the city and sing the song of the dialectic, the nice phrase from Book 6 and 7, rather than to actually administer the city. Again, it's almost as if an admission that perhaps the perfectly just city can't be perfectly just, because the ruling element, in order to be perfectly happy, has to be compelled to do something it doesn't want to do. Be that as it may, let's grant that this city would, if not the best city, would be better than any other city that's ever existed and ever will exist and can exist. But what we learn in Book 8, again, which is the resumption of the argument, at the end of Book 4. Remember, Books 5 through 7 are a great diversion having to do with the goodness, the genuine goodness, and the possibility of the best city. And the regimes that are suggested at the end of Book 4 are, of course, become the main theme in Book 8. So even if it comes into being, the best city can't last. And that's where, on 546A, page 223, is a reminder that the Platonic universe is not the biblical universe. Even though there's sin and death and destruction in the biblical universe, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, in the Quran, all Western forms of biblical faith in omniscient and omnipotent God have a happy ending. The world will eventually, in its corruption and sinfulness, will be washed away and washed clean by God's redemptive power. God created the world, God will redeem the world, and will eventually redeem the broken and corrupt world from the power of human sin and imperfection. Well, that universe doesn't exist for Plato. There's no God here. There's no God for Plato and Aristotle, as you'll see. There is order, there is purpose, there is meaning, and there is goodness. But the goodness, again, is an aspiration of the universe. It's not a guarantee. And even though the eternal idea of the good that keeps becoming, wanting to be being, that keeps human beings wanting to be immortal in a mortal shell and mortal world, and even moves us to philosophize when we're capable of it or come in contact with somebody who's capable of it. None of these things are permanent, although it may be that philosophy in the individual soul may lead to a bit more permanence than the perfect city. So why is this? Why is the Platonic universe a sober, universe rather than a joyful universe. Because, as we've seen, all things in this universe are becoming. They're matter attempting to become immortal and eternal idea or form. And matter can't become immortal. And so, as Socrates reminds, and this is the sober reminder that begins the descent into decay and death, that is the promise of Book VIII, something like this: a city so composed is hard to be moved. But since everything that has come into being, there is decay, not even a composition of this will remain for all time. It will be dissolved. So all things die, including the best. Now, why point this out? Because one of the reasons Marxism in the 19th and 20th century, for instance, becomes so murderous is because Marx believed that the final revision of the human condition can be achieved by revolution. The communism that is portrayed in some ways derivatively in 1984 and is portrayed enthusiastically and realistically, at least in an adumbrated form in Marx's early works, in the 1833 German Ideology or in the 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, and of course in the Communist Manifesto and in Das Kapital, in Capital, and that becomes part of Marxist visionarianism, says that no, perfection is possible and permanent. And so if perfection is possible and permanent, isn't it worth perhaps wiping, as Solzhenitsyn suggests the Soviet regime did from its inception in 1917 until 1977 when he was released? About 100 million people, which most observers think is a bit high, but even if it's half of that, the Chinese regime, the People's Republic, probably did wipe away 100 million people. In the Three Antis campaign in 1952, anti-imperialism, anti-individualism, anti-bourgeoisism, whatever it was, and that was followed by the Five Antis campaigns. They were systematically murdering 500,000 people a month. It's a lot of people to send to their graves. But isn't it worth sending all those people to their graves if, in fact, you can bring the perfect regime into perpetual existence? If you could bring perfection, permanent perfection, it might be worth slaughtering millions. And once the machine gun makes it possible, then you don't have to wait for the people over the age of 10 to send their to leave the city and give their children over to philosophers. You can simply murder them all, and with gas chambers and machine guns, or the killing fields as in Cambodia. So the sober politics of Socrates' Plato does have value because it might just restrain that utopian impulse to do away with this imperfect world and replace it with a perfect world, if in fact that perfect world really is a utopia. It's impossible. So even if the Republic shows what the perfect city would look like, and even if that doesn't exactly fit our tastes in 2021, nevertheless, there's already an important lesson to be learned from the Republic. You're never going to create permanent perfection. Only in the biblical universe, where there's a creator God, is that possible. So that's a sober lesson to begin Book 8 with, but not a stupid lesson, it seems to me. If it's true, you have to decide that yourselves. So, what will start the decay from the perfect city into the imperfect and decaying city? I'm going to read this passage. It's one of the most difficult I've ever encountered in any form of reading. That includes the Talmud, Dr. Dunn's autobiography, Heidegger. This is clearly one of the densest and most inscrutable passages ever written by a human being. So I'll read it, and then I'll try to suggest what's happening here. So, and this will be its dissolution on the top of 224, 546a. Bearing and barrenness of soul and bodies comes not only to plants in the earth, but to animals on the earth, when revolutions complete for each other the bearing round of circles. For ones with short lives, the journey is short. For those whose lives are on the opposite, the journey is the opposite. Although they are wise, men you educated as leaders of the cities will nonetheless fail to hit on the prosperous birth and barrenness of your kind with calculations aided by sensation. But it will pass them by, and they will at some time beget children when they should not. For a divine birth, there is a period comprehended by a perfect number. For a human birth, by the first number in which root and square increases, comprising 3 distances and 4 limits, of elements that make like and unlike, and that wax and wane render everything conversable and rational. Of these elements, the root 4-3 mated with 5 thrice increased produces 2 harmonies. One of them is equal to an equal number of times, taken 100 times over. The other is of equal length in one way, but is an oblong on one side of 100 rational diameters of the 5, lacking 1 for each, or, if of irrational diameters, lacking 2 for each, on the other side of 100 cubes of the 3. The whole geometrical number is sovereign of better and worse begettings. And when your guardians from ignorance of them cause grooms to live with brides out of season, the children will have neither good natures nor good luck. Their predecessors will choose the best of these children, but nevertheless, since they are unworthy, when they in turn come to powers of their fathers, they will as guardians first begin to neglect us by having less consideration than is required, first begin to neglect us for music and second for gymnastic, and from there our young will become more unmusical. And rulers chosen from them won't be guardians very apt at testing Hesiod's races and yours. Remember, this is an allusion to the noble lie at the end of Book 3. Gold and silver and bronze and iron. And the chaotic mixing of iron and silver and of bronze with gold engenders unlikeness and harmonious irregularity, which, once they arise, always breed war and hatred in the place where they happen to arise. Faction must always said to be of this ancestry where it happens to arise. And will say, says Glaucon, that what the muses answer is right. Necessarily, I said, for they are muses. What, he said, do the muses say next? Whoop! Well, I can't make sense of that, and I don't know of any human being who can, and I think Plato understands that. So what's he saying here? There is buried in all of this mathematical formulation the idea that what will keep the perfect city in being is the philosopher's ability to see every soul in the city, and to remember this is not a city with private eros. Obviously, there are still bodies meeting up with each other, male and female bodies generating children. But remember, this isn't a city of free love. It's not like everyone hopping into bed with everyone. Everyone mates with everyone at the direction of the philosophic rulers at the times and with the individuals. And let's not lose its shocking character. In Book 5, once you give up private families and private husbands and wives and private children, isn't there a danger if you mate the right body with the other right male body with the right female body that you're going to have fathers living with their daughters? I mean, having sex with daughters and mothers having sex with sons. And the Republic only partially wipes that fear of incestuous relationships away by adding the idea that under a certain age, you won't have sex with somebody who's older or younger than you. Therefore, you don't have the potential. You still have the potential, but not the likelihood of having sex with your father or mother. But with your brother or sister, that is to say, the people of the same age of you, there's still that. So remember, this is not the erotic city. It's not the city of San Francisco or New York. It's the unerotic city where people, again, this is not Brave New World where babies are decanted or created by artificial genesis. You still need human bodies to have sex and to have women raising and nursing. But again, remember, the baby is taken from the mother the moment after birth. So there's no erotic identification or attachment. So this city is the most unerotic city you can imagine because people have sex, but not because they're attracted to somebody, but because the rulers deem X has to mate with Y at a certain time to produce the right kind of children. And so this complicated mathematical mess at the beginning here of Book 8 seems to be a confession that no human mind, even the most philosophic, even the most Socratic of Socrates' mind could not keep this up. And eventually the wrong people are going to mate with the wrong people, the wrong children are going to be born, and this becomes the decay of the city. So that's I think this inscrutable stuff at the beginning. Then I think that's the serious meaning behind it so far as I can detect it. So after this initial slippage, uh, uh, then you find the decay of the soul in each one, and of course, the three parts of the soul, um, and uh, and uh, and as each type of soul decays into the worst kind of soul after it, which in other words means that in the best human being, the highest part of the soul rules over the two lower parts of the soul, thumos and eros. But obviously, uh, uh, as you decay, and not only can you not only see other souls, you can't even see your own soul. So eventually, you too, mortal and fallible and everything, in each successive generation, like the wealthy, we'll get into the decay itself, but uh, you won't be able to contain your thumotic or erotic longings. So decay means, of course, you create human beings where the worst parts of the soul rule over the higher parts of the soul. And that means, in some ways, human happiness becomes less possible. More about that in a minute. Um, and also, if remember the Republic's core source of information as to how to guide and construct politics and what the nature of politics is and the virtues of politics is the human soul. That's why Book IV, as I've said many times, is the foundation really of the entire Republic. Um, so it's a psychological political science because the cities are ranked and distinguished on the kinds of soul that dominates in that kind of constitution. So, so now we return to this political science, which again is a science of decay or decline. So, the kinds of constitutions, the typology, are arrayed from good to bad, um, and are mirrors of the decaying soul in them and the decaying soul that causes the next stage of regime. So it's important to have a little vocabulary lesson, and we'll come back to this when we look at the ethics and the politics of Aristotle too. But to understand these regime types, and including the best one we've just seen, it's important to have a little bit Greek vocabulary. The core word in many of these words is kratein. Kratein means to rule, to have power, force. Kratia, krateia means, and in English, so the noun form krateia, kratia is power or rule. And in its Latin, and then its French, and then its English version, this kratia, krateia, becomes krasi. The krasi part of the words means rule of. So we have Aristos. Plato's real name, by the way, was Ariston, which means the best. Aristos is the best. So aristokrateia is the rule of the best. The highest over the lowest, the higher over the lower, etc. Time is the Greek word for honor or reputation, like military honor. And of course, this is what the thumotic part of the soul loves, as we'll see. Oligos is the Greek word for few, but in Aristotle's classification, as in Plato's, and in general usage, oligos meant the rule of the few wealthy. So, an archeia, as in oligarchy, archeia. Arche is a complex Greek word. It means beginning, power, force, rule, original. And so archeia is a synonym for rule. So oligarchy, oligarcheia, is the rule of the few wealthy. It's the regime in which, by the way, you're going to see both aristocracy, both aristocracy and timocracy, the rule of the honor lovers and the rule of the best, are higher still ruling over lower. The problem with when you get to oligarchy, like Cephalus, who was clearly an oligarch, although he was a wealthy man, and the rule of the oligarchs, like in so-called aristocracies in the Western world, which are really oligarchies, the rule of the few wealthy, the few wealthy. In some ways, those were regimes that thought that the best human life was with the wealthiest human beings, and that the wealthiest human beings were the best human beings. So both oligarchy, where the wealthy rule, which is after all about erotic acquisition of property and wealth, and democracy, which is actually based upon envy of the wealth, are both erotic regimes where eros is uncontrolled by the higher elements of the soul. And so we have the five regimes that exist. Aristocracy, the rule of the best, the rule of, and that's what the best city is an aristocracy, which is either a kingship, where the one most philosophic rule rules everything, and or a class of philosophers rule over, and the city is put in the right place. Virtue exists throughout the city, and virtue exists in each soul because each soul is doing what it should be doing. Once, though, as we saw with that opaque and vague kind of decline, once the philosophers lose the ability to generate enough ruling souls to keep the city philosophic, then the lower, but still middle, higher part of the soul begins to dominate. The city becomes warlike, aggressive, because the rulers crave honor and glory. And so you'll still find people willing to sacrifice for the city. It's still a patriarchal city, patriotic city. But nevertheless, you could see in 1984 during 2 Minutes Hate that that self-righteous anger clearly is not the most reflective part of the soul. Once the lower parts of the soul start obscuring the capacity to see the truth, then the divided line becomes more, in some ways, a description not only of the form of cognition of people whose lower parts of the soul dominate their reason and their self-rule. But remember, the philosopher gets angry or erotic at the right time for the right reasons at the right point. Once you're a timocratic person, and what you love is honor and besting others in victory and sport and contest, and where shame, like the Japanese uh, uh, um, samurai culture, which is extremely, or the knighthood culture in the medieval ages, which were essentially timocratic regimes, and the regimes of Christian Europe and most of the world, these aristocrat, so-called, or even the Roman world, these so-called aristocratic regimes were actually timocratic oligarchies, families by birth, where people were taught to be warriors. It's the same with, by the way, with the warrior class in the Indian caste system, where you had Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaishya. We had workers. In fact, some people say that Plato got this from India, or that Indians got it from Plato. But the caste system in India was essentially the Brahmins were like the priestly, meaning the spiritual philosophic class, the warrior class in the middle. But the warrior class really means the aristocrats, the knights, the guys with horses and contests and honors and jousts and all that stuff in the West. And those regimes have existed all over the world. So, but once the soul gets out of balance and the erotic elements start claiming it, then the love of the firstborn and wealthy and noble families actually then becomes the love of wealth. And very quickly, democracies degenerate into oligarchies, and there were oligarchic elements in our own background, where once there were property qualifications, and there still are in the House of Lords in the British Constitution, which is a mixed constitution, has democratic and oligarchic elements, as do we, by the way, as you'll see when we turn to Aristotle. So in the wealthy regime, the wealthy man craves erotic gratification by accumulating wealth and property. And then, of course, once you're already being ruled by the lower parts of the soul, then you lose the capacity of the soul to rule. So we're almost at the bottom of the heap here, and that's democracy. And we'll come back to his characterization of democracy because it's kind of interesting for us, especially. But in the democracy, the problem is that the chase for wealth has resulted in few wealthy and many poor. And so the poor in an oligarchy begin to resent, even though they want to be their wealthy rulers, they begin to want and resent the wealth of their rulers at the same time. And so Democrats then the democratic soul is unleashed because ultimately the envy of the wealth of the wealthy few becomes the leveling or redistributive element of the democratic masses who are poor and angry about their poverty and therefore seek to equalize society, seeing themselves as equal and free. So, uh, but once, and you're going to see there's a hint of nihilism in democracy, because if everybody's equal and everybody does what they want, if you have freedom and equality, then there is no rule of the city other than chance and freedom and whatever takes hold of the democratic mob. And to some degree, if you've read The Tale of Two Cities or seen The Dark Knight Rises, which is ultimately a retelling of Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, the mob rule scene in those movies, the great 1936 version of The Tale of Two Cities, it shows that the democratic rule is not only the love of freedom and equality, and also eventually becomes resentment of inequality. It also becomes a form of mob rule where literally the ability to reason collectively has been swayed by passion. So once you get to the point where the potential anarchy of democracy begins to destroy the capacity of society to order itself, then tyranny is just around the corner. And there you have Plato's political science. His typology, as I said, the typology is an arrangement of types, and it's not only a typology but a ranking. Aristotle is also going to produce such a typology and a ranking, and as you'll see, it resembles this ranking, but it is also profoundly different because whereas Plato takes his mirror for politics from the human soul, Aristotle looks to other factors to classify regimes, even if he ends up with roughly the same 6 regimes that Plato produces. So you could say the analogy between the soul and the city, begun in Book II, has found its completion here. Justice is the virtue of the well-ordered, happy soul and the well-ordered, happy city. But whereas the best individual soul can attain order and bliss, if capable of it, through dialectical philosophy, and only when you get to be 68 do the capacities of your mind begin to undermine your ability to philosophize. But other than that, you could say that once philosophy takes hold in the soul of an individual and loosens them from the chains on the bottom of the cave, you could say the change in the individual soul generated by philosophy and philosophic self-consciousness may be able to last the whole life of that soul. Not so the city. Because the best city, remember, is at most a brief and fleeting possibility. Yet, so what's the point, you could say? What comes out of this? What's it all for? By seeing the typology of regimes and constitutions, the statesman or stateswoman, young college students at Converse University, aspiring upwards to ruling places in society, will come away from their course in ancient political philosophy understanding something of the nature and limitations of human beings and their potentials, and that therefore perhaps what comes out of Book VIII and the whole Republic and the politics, for that matter, of Aristotle is the ability of people with potential political authority to diagnose the health of one's existing city and perhaps perfect it, improve it, prevent decay. As you're going to see, both Platonic political philosophy and political science and Aristotelian political philosophy and political science, and I think Ciceronian, all look at the human world, your human world, my human world, and say, what are the real possibilities when it comes to goodness? The Republic holds out this tantalizing vision of perfection, but it's amazing how tantalizing and far-fetched that attainability of that perfection is. So it's probably not likely that you or I, either in our small circle or if we should eventually come to have political power, will be able to perfect the human world. That somehow, as he says before the third wave in Book V, that somehow the miseries of humanity are always going to affect the political world. But even if perfection's not possible, it may be that improvement is. Maybe as your democratic regime is moving down towards nihilism, you can kind of exert an influence, a cultural, a political influence to kind of move it upwards towards oligarchy and aristocracy, even democracy. And to some degree, you could say during the 20th century, the United States regime probably had certain elements of a democratic regime in the military virtue and victory that we saw the masses of democratic men capable of in World War II in defeating the forces of communism and Nazism. So if you can't perfect the world, maybe you can improve it. What if you can't improve it? What if the forces of decay are irresistible? Then if you can't prevent the decay, perhaps you can slow down the decay, which is better than letting it run rampant. And even if there's ultimately nothing you can do to arrest the decline of your political society and your city is on the way down, then perhaps you can watch it decay and collapse with understanding and pity as one contemplates the eternal good that mortal life can only imitate, glance at, longingly, and pass away. So it's not just a question of what to do with one's life. And if one can philosophize, one should philosophize because therein lies self-consciousness, self-mastery, the ability to see your life in its essence and to master the different parts of your soul. If you have political aspirations or political concerns, then if Plato really has succeeded, Socrates, Plato have succeeded in laying bare the nature of politics and its essential dynamics and connections, then in the same way that going to medical school might help you become a doctor, that might actually help a fat old man not die tomorrow, but at least retain some aspect of his health. Or so because people don't go to medical school unless they thought they could actually do something in the world. So maybe the political science that Plato makes possible through his philosophic inquiry into the nature of the soul and justice and virtues, maybe that makes possible a kind of political science that, if it can't perfect, can improve. If it can't improve, can prevent decay. If it can't prevent decay, can slow down decay. And even if it can't slow down decay, at least understand the decay. And in the midst of distress, perhaps understanding one's distress is better than not understanding one's distress. So that's Book VIII. And a couple of notes and reflections on passing. First, the decay in the regimes in the soul in Book VIII is necessary not only to create a typology of regimes and constitutions, and remember, we're going to come back to this word again in the politics. The essential Greek fact, the essential Greek word, the concrete thing, is the political community, the city, the nation, the country, the polis. Polis is city. So politeia is the abstraction of the city. It's the name of this book. It's called The Republic. It's actually politeia. But the real translation, and this is really what you find in Book VIII and at the end of Book IV, which is interrupted by 5 through 7 and then resumed here in Book VIII, and taken up as the core of Aristotle's Politics, is the constitution or regime. Regime is a French word, régime, that comes from the Latin word rex, regus, which means king, the ruling element. Constitution is also a Latin word, the synonyms of politeia, as we're going to talk more about in Aristotle's Politics, but here it's relevant. Constitution comes from con, cum, together in, and stare, which means to stand. So the Constitution is the whole system that makes the political system stand together, hold together as a unity, and gives it it's like the theme of the symphony. So the politeia means constitution or regime. So you could say we mistranslate politeia into the Republic, but that's just stuck because that's how God translated into Latin and into English, etc. But this book is really about constitutions, about regimes, the best regime, and then the not so best regime, and then the worst regimes. So in some ways, the whole point of this decline and decay from the best city that Book VIII chronicles isn't just to establish its typology, to found the nature of political science, and to enable the observer to see the kinds of politics around him or her, Remember, this seeing of the decline of the regimes from best to worst also sets up the critical question that began the Republic, or at least Book II of the Republic, the comparison of the just and the unjust man. And the unjust man, the guy who has the ring of Gyges, who goes around and does whatever he wants, takes whatever he wants, who'd be which common sense doesn't want to see. Common opinion wants to condemn him as an unjust man by calling him unjust and then saying, well, he's not going to get the good things of life and he will have an unhappy life after death. But common sense opinion says, but that guy gets whatever he wants whenever he wants it. He's more powerful than everyone else and everyone's afraid of him. He's like a god to human beings. Who wouldn't want to be a god compared to the run of pitiful human beings around us? Well, if you've read Dune, which is coming out in another version, by the way, sometime this year once theaters open up, perhaps being the most powerful human being in the world isn't the happiest human being. Perhaps power without justice and virtue actually leads to misery. Guess what? That's Book 9. So Voldemort, as I suggested at the beginning of these comments, you'll see that Plato, Socrates anticipate Rowling and Voldemort. So you need Book 8 to get to Book 9. I love being brilliant because Book 9 returns to this great question. Why is the tyrant, in fact, not the happiest, but the unhappiest of men, for reasons we'll see on Wednesday or on the next lecture? Another thing to think about here is that think of where democracy is in this. It's pretty low. It's the next to the worst regime. It's not a good regime. And in fact, Aristotle is going to call democracy the best of the bad regimes. We, on the other hand, are moderns in our little modern cave, our little Lockean, Hobbesian, Rousseauian, Marxian caves, Machiavellian caves. And we're Democrats. We call our regime a democracy. We're proud of it. We want to make it even more democratic. So one thing to note here is Socrates and Plato are Athenians talking to young Athenians, and you would think, well, all they're doing is affirming their Greek values. But remember, Socrates have already shaken these young guys free of their Greek values because you've already made women equal to them and destroyed the family and private property and made philosophers rule. So he's already pretty much shaken them out of their cave. He's loosened their chains and they're crawling upwards. But this confirms the notion that Plato and Aristotle are, even though they're Athenians, their political philosophy is not Athenian because it relegates the Athenian regime, democracy, to a pretty low status. And so you could say what he's trying to do here is lead them out of their cave. They're inclined to see Athenian institutions as the best. Well, it turns out Athenian institutions aren't the best. They're pretty low down there. So, but think about this for a minute. Isn't Athens a democracy? And to teach young Athenians not to respect the democracy and to have contempt for it because it's pretty the next to the worst regime? Maybe Socrates does corrupt the young. Another thought. Don't they have our modern number, as I suggested a minute ago? Don't we moderns, those of us born in the United States and in the modern world, who love freedom and equality, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and we better make them as free and equal even more than they want. We love freedom and equality rather than justice or virtue. Or rather, given the nature of our cave, wouldn't it be free to say that we equate justice with freedom and equality? And if anything, then you could say Plato has got our number because freedom and equality are sweet. There's no question about it. Do your own thing. And yet you could ask, how are we doing with that? We are a society where now 70,000 people a year die of overdoses of heroin. We promise the pursuit of happiness. Does there seem to be happiness around in our society? Are we drifting towards nihilism? Is our freedom and equality becoming angry and unrestrained? And actually not destructive, not attaining of happiness, destructive of happiness. Are people happier than they were 200 years ago, 500 years ago? Are we, as I said, are we drifting towards nihilism, as did the Weimar Republic in 1929, 30, 31, which almost fell apart because of its democratic nihilism, and perhaps towards tyranny, perhaps even scientific tyranny. If you've read Brave New World, Remember, Nazism flowed out of nihilism, and 1984, the world of 1984 formed out of chaos and dissolution. So you could say this. We in the modern world might say, well, this is just an old book. It doesn't have any relevance to our lives and our society. But you could say this. Hasn't a journey through the Republic perhaps shaken even a little bit of one's dogmatic attachment to democracy? At least dragged a few of us towards the mouth of our modern cave? So the Republic probably doesn't have the answer to every political issue, doesn't have the answer to every political crisis. But if it has truth in it, it may show us that our modern embrace of simple equality and freedom is not the same thing as an embrace of virtue or an embrace of happiness. So uh, that would be another reason for reading the Republic, even in the year 2020, 2021. And yet, let's end on a positive note. Didn't democratic Athens let Socrates go around for 70 years singing the irritating song of the dialectic? Didn't it let Socrates be Socrates? Didn't it let Socrates attain philosophic happiness? Because it's true. If everyone can do his own thing, the philosopher too can do his own thing. Until he gets everyone so mad at him that they want to deny tenure or whatever or kick him out. But you have to say that it's not just that Athens let Socrates go around for 70 years before it killed him. It also let Plato and Aristotle establish their schools of philosophy. So it's clear philosophy couldn't exist in Sparta. It couldn't exist in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic. But even in corrupt old decadent America, just like corrupt old decadent Athens, it is possible to philosophize and to reach out to young minds who may, in their curiosity, want to know about the meaning of life, virtue, and happiness, if not truth.